They were slaves who had never known freedom, purchased as children, stripped of their names, torn from every family they had ever loved. And on the morning of September 3rd, 1260, those same men did what no army on earth had managed to do in 40 years of unbroken Mongol conquest. They baited the world's greatest killing machine into a valley and destroyed it so completely that the Mongol Empire never fully recovered. Here is what almost nobody tells you. The trick they used was not a military tactic, it was a psychological trap, and the Mongols walked straight into it because they were too confident to imagine it was possible. Think about what confidence looks like after 40 years without a single major defeat. Not ordinary confidence, not the kind a general carries into a battle he expects to win. Something deeper, something bone deep and almost theological. The certainty that the universe itself has placed you above other men, that your enemies will break before you not because you were stronger, but because breaking before the Mongols is simply what enemies do. By 1260, that certainty had become the Mongol army's most powerful weapon. It had also become its most dangerous vulnerability, and a Mamluk commander named Baibars had spent years studying exactly how to use it against them. Most accounts of Ain Jalut frame it as a battle, a brilliant ambush, a flanking maneuver, a decisive cavalry charge. And that is not wrong, but it misses the deeper truth. What happened in the valley of Ain Jalut was not primarily a contest of arms, it was a contest of minds. Baibars did not just defeat the Mongols, he made them defeat themselves. He constructed a reality in which the Mongol army believed it was doing exactly what it was trained to do, right up until the moment the trap closed and there was nothing left to do but die. By the time you reach the end of this story, you will understand something that military historians spend careers unpacking. That the most dangerous thing you can give an army is not superior weapons or superior numbers. It is a predictable system of behavior that an intelligent enemy can learn, anticipate, and turn against you. The Mongols had built the most sophisticated military machine in the history of the medieval world, and Baibars used every part of that machine against its owners. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story of history, the terrain, the tactics, the blood and the dust and the genius behind the legend, hit that subscribe button and join us. This is the kind of story that deserves to be told properly. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, because this community spans every corner of the world and I genuinely want to know. Now, let us begin. To understand what happened at Ain Jalut, you need to understand the world it happened inside. Not the world as we map it today, with its clean national borders and its stable institutions, but the world as it felt in 1260, a world that was, in every meaningful sense, coming apart at the seams. Begin with what the Mongol Empire had already done. The numbers, when you look at them directly, are almost impossible to process as historical facts. They read more like mythology. Between 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes on the steppes north of China, and 1260, when Kitbaka's army rode south into Palestine, the Mongols had conquered more territory than any empire in human history. China, Korea, Central Asia, Persia, the Caucasus, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Anatolia, all of it. Millions of square miles, dozens of distinct civilizations, hundreds of cities that had stood for centuries, absorbed or erased within a single human lifetime. The standard estimates for the death toll produced by Mongol conquest range between 30 and 40 million people. In the 13th century, that figure represented approximately 10% of the entire human population of the planet. Let that number sit for a moment. Not a city lost, not a dynasty displaced. 10% of all human beings alive on Earth dead within 60 years. And the mechanism of that death was not simply superior force. The Mongols were, in purely physical terms, not dramatically larger or stronger than the armies they destroyed. Their secret was something more unsettling. It was a system, a military doctrine so sophisticated, so ruthlessly optimized over generations of steppe warfare that it consistently defeated enemies who outnumbered outnumbered them, who possessed stronger individual warriors, who fought from behind stone walls and with every tactical advantage that terrain and fortification could provide. The core of the system was mobility. The Mongol army moved faster than its enemies could react. Not slightly faster, not faster on good terrain, faster under any conditions across any landscape in any season. A Mongol force could cover 60 to 80 miles a day over distances that would exhaust a European cavalry unit in a week. This was not an accident. It was the product of a nomadic culture that had spent centuries learning to keep animals alive and moving across the harshest terrain on Earth. Every Mongol warrior maintained a string of 3 to 5 horses, rotating mounts constantly so that the army always had fresh animals and could maintain speed indefinitely. They ate from their horses, dried meat, dried blood, kumis fermented from mare's milk, which meant they required almost no logistical tail. No supply wagons, no granaries, no supply lines to guard or cut. The army fed itself on horseback and moved like nothing else in the medieval world. The second pillar of the system was coordination. The Mongol army was organized on a decimal structure, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 that allowed commanders to communicate, maneuver, and concentrate force with a precision that contemporary European armies simply could not match. Flags, horn signals, and smoke relays created a command and control network that functioned across distances of 50 miles or more. In an age when most battles devolved into a chaotic melee within minutes of first contact, the Mongols could execute complex, multi-column maneuvers in real time, adapting to enemy movements as they happened. The third pillar was psychological. The Mongols understood, with a sophistication that would not appear in Western military theory for another 6 centuries, that the mind of the enemy was a battlefield as important as the physical terrain. Their atrocity was not random. It was deliberate, calibrated, and strategically precise. Cities that submitted immediately were sometimes treated with relative mercy. Cities that resisted were annihilated so completely, so publicly, and so systematically that the stories spread faster than the army itself. By the time Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon of a new city, its inhabitants had already heard what happened to the city 2 weeks' march behind. Entire populations surrendered without a fight, not because they were cowardly, but because they had done the mathematics and understood that resistance was a choice between death now and death slightly later. This system had been tested against every military culture it encountered: the Jin dynasty in northern China, the elite cataphract cavalry of the Khwarezmian Empire, who had been considered the finest horsemen in Central Asia, the heavy knights of Poland and Hungary at the battles of Lignitsa and Mohi in 1241, where Mongol forces destroyed 2 European armies in 2 days in 2 different countries, the Abbasid Caliphate, the oldest and most prestigious institution in the Islamic world, whose capital Baghdad had been considered unconquerable for 500 years. All of them dismantled. Baghdad deserves a moment of attention because it speaks directly to the psychological world that Baibars was operating inside in 1260. In February 1258, Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and commander of the Western Mongol campaigns, arrived outside the walls of Baghdad with an army somewhere between 150 and 200,000 men. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim commanded approximately 50,000 defenders. What followed was not a battle, it was a systematic destruction. Within a week, the walls had been breached. Within 2, the Caliph had surrendered. What happened next was recorded by dozens of witnesses and shaped the collective memory of the Islamic world for generations. Hulagu had the Caliph executed in the Mongol manner, which in this case meant being wrapped in felt carpets and trampled by horses. This was not cruelty for its own sake. The Mongols believed the blood of a ruler could not touch the earth, and so this method was considered within their cosmology a form of respect. The distinction was lost on the Muslim world. The Caliph was the symbolic head of the entire Islamic community, the successor to the Prophet's authority, a figure whose legitimacy stretched back 600 years. His death in that manner, by those men, sent a shockwave through the Muslim world that had not yet subsided 2 years later when Baibars stood in the hills above Ain Jalut and watched Kitbuka's cavalry descend into the valley. That shockwave was the terrain Baibars was navigating, not the physical valley, the psychological landscape of a civilization that had watched its most sacred institution reduced to carpets and hoofprints, and was struggling to believe that anything could stop what had come for them. Hulagu's forces had swept through the rest of Mesopotamia after Baghdad with the same mechanical efficiency. Aleppo fell in January 1260 after a siege of barely a week. Damascus surrendered days later without a fight, its governors accepting Mongol suzerainty rather than risk a defense that every military calculation suggested was futile. Syria was now Mongol territory, the road to Egypt was open, and Hulagu sent Kitbuka south with approximately 20,000 men, or possibly fewer, sources disagree, to complete the conquest of the Levant and set the stage for an invasion of Egypt that would have ended the last independent Muslim power in the region. But here, the story turns on a detail that most accounts of Ain Jalut skid past in their rush to get to the battle. Hulagu was not there. Shortly before Kitbuka reached Palestine, word arrived from the Mongol heartland that Munka Khan, the Great Khan, had died. Hulagu, who held his position in the west partly through the authority of Munka's patronage, had political reasons to return east and participate in the succession struggle that would determine which of his cousins would hold the title of supreme Mongol ruler. He withdrew the bulk of his forces, leaving Kitbuka to hold and advance with what was, by Mongol standards, a relatively small force. This is the detail that changes everything. Kitbuka was not advancing with the full weight of the Mongol war machine. He was advancing with a vanguard, a capable and battle-hardened force, but not the overwhelming hammer that had shattered Baghdad and Aleppo. He had somewhere between 12 and 20,000 men, depending on which historian you trust. What he had in abundance, what he had in quantities that functioned as a kind of blindness, was confidence. The confidence of an army that had not lost in living memory, the confidence of a culture that had institutionalized the expectation of victory, the confidence of a man who had seen enemies submit before his scouts even reached their walls. Kitbuka looked south toward Egypt and saw one more obstacle in a career defined by removing obstacles. He did not yet know that in the Egyptian court, a man named Baibars had been watching him for months and had already finished building the trap. But before we understand what Baibars built, we need to understand what Baibars was, because the story of Ain Jalut cannot be separated from the story of the Mamluk institution itself, and the Mamluk institution was one of the strangest and most consequential military experiments in human history. We need to stop here and correct something that almost every popular account of this battle gets wrong. The Mamluks are often described as an army of slaves, which is technically accurate but deeply misleading if you apply the word slave in the sense that most modern readers understand it. The mental image that word produces of a brutalized, broken, desperate population forced into service against its will is almost precisely the opposite of what the Mamluk system created. What the Mamluk system created was something more like an elite military caste that happened to be recruited through purchase rather than birth, trained with an intensity that bordered on the fanatical, and organized around a code of loyalty and professional excellence that many free armies would have struggled to match. Here is how it worked. Mamluk recruits, the word Mamluk itself means owned in Arabic, were purchased as children, typically between the ages of 7 and 12, from the Turkic and Circassian peoples of the steppes and the Caucasus. These were not random slaves. Buyers specifically sought children from nomadic warrior cultures, children who already had the physical foundations of horsemen and the psychological hardness of people who grew up in harsh conditions. The Egyptian Sultanate paid serious money for the best specimens, and the recruitment networks were sophisticated and well organized. Once purchased, a Mamluk child entered a training regimen that consumed his entire adolescence, not just his days, his identity. He was given a new name. He was immersed in Islam. Most recruits were not Muslim at the time of purchase, and conversion was mandatory. He was taught Arabic and the religious and philosophical foundations of Islamic civilization, and he was trained in warfare with an obsessive, all-consuming focus that had no parallel in the medieval world. The core of Mamluk training was the Furusiya, the art of horsemanship and mounted combat, which the Egyptian training system had developed into something approaching a science. A fully trained Mamluk warrior was expected to be able to fire a composite bow accurately from horseback at full gallop in any direction, including behind him. He was expected to be able to perform a full draw, aim, release, and recovery in under 3 seconds.
He was trained to do this in formation, maintaining coordination with the riders to his left and right while the ground beneath him was moving at 30 miles an hour. And when the bow was no longer useful, when the enemy had closed to the range where missiles became irrelevant, he was expected to be one of the finest swordsmen on a horse in the known world. A Mongol warrior was a superb generalist. He had grown up on the steppe, riding before he could walk, hunting before he was 10, fighting in small-scale intertribal conflicts that honed his reflexes and his aggression. He was dangerous, flexible, and almost impossible to exhaust. But his skills had been developed organically, self-taught, refined through practice and experience, rather than systematic instruction. His training had never had a single focus. A fully trained Mamluk was something different. He was a precision instrument designed with one specific purpose in mind: the destruction of enemy cavalry in close combat. Every hour of his adolescence had been aimed at that purpose. By the time he entered active service, he had been doing nothing but preparing for exactly this for a decade or more. The Mamluk system also created, somewhat paradoxically, a culture of intense loyalty. The bond between a Mamluk and the man who had purchased and trained him, his ustad, his master, was not the bond of a slave to an owner. It was closer to the bond of a soldier to the commanding officer who had made him. The ustad had invested years in the Mamluk's development, had guided his education, had shaped his identity. The Mamluk had, in return, given those years. The relationship was asymmetrical, but real, and the loyalty it created was one of the primary sources of Mamluk military cohesion. By 1260, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was the product of 2 generations of this system. Sultan Qutuz, who commanded the Egyptian forces at Ain Jalut, was himself a Mamluk. So was Baibars. So were most of the senior officers in the army. The institution had essentially seized political power in Egypt in 1250 during the chaos of the Seventh Crusade, when a military coup replaced the last Ayyubid Sultan with a Mamluk commander, and the army that had once served a dynasty had become a dynasty itself. This is important because it means the men making the decisions at Ain Jalut were not politicians directing professional soldiers from a safe distance. They were the professional soldiers. They had trained together, fought together, betrayed and reconciled with each other in the brutal internal politics of the Mamluk court. They understood war the way a craftsman understands his craft, with the intimate embodied knowledge of people who have spent their lives inside it. Baibars, in particular, was a figure of remarkable complexity. He was a Kipchak Chark, purchased as a child somewhere around the 1230s, trained in the Egyptian system, and by 1260 already one of the most experienced and capable military commanders in the region. He had fought the Crusaders. He had fought other Mamluk factions. He had, earlier in his career, actually served briefly in a region that had been under Mongol influence, an experience that gave him something almost none of his contemporaries possessed: direct personal knowledge of how Mongol forces operated. He had watched them, he had studied them, he understood their tactical patterns, their preferences, their assumptions, and he had formed a judgment about them that was, at the time, an almost unthinkable act of strategic imagination. The Mongols could be beaten, not through overwhelming force, which Egypt did not possess, not through the kind of siege warfare that slowed their advance but could not stop it. They could be beaten the way you beat a system, by understanding it from the inside, identifying the assumptions it depends on to function, and systematically destroying those assumptions. The Mongols won, Baibars had concluded, not primarily because they were stronger. They won because they were faster, more coordinated, and psychologically dominant. Remove the psychological dominance by demonstrating that their invincibility was a story rather than a fact. Reduce the effectiveness of their speed and coordination by choosing terrain that constrained both. And then put the finest mounted warriors in the medieval world in front of them and see what happened. This was the theory. Building it into a plan required solving a problem that had defeated every other military commander who had faced the Mongols. How do you get them to come to you, on terrain of your choosing, without showing them what you are doing? The answer was simplicity itself once you understood Mongol psychology. You let them see what they expected to see.
Qutuz marched the Egyptian army north from Cairo in late August 1260. This decision was itself remarkable. Every precedent, every military calculation, Every lesson drawn from the fall of Baghdad and Damascus and every other city that had attempted to resist the Mongols suggested that the defensive position, waiting behind walls, making the Mongols come to you, stretching their supply lines, was the only rational strategy. Qutuz did the opposite. He went north. He went to meet them. The reasoning was subtle and psychologically sophisticated. An army that came out of its walls and marched toward the Mongols was not behaving like a frightened prey animal waiting to be consumed. It was behaving like a force that believed in its own capability. Qutuz was making a statement before a single arrow was fired. We are not afraid of you. That statement had value, not because it was necessarily true, fear was entirely rational given the Mongol track record, but because it was the first step in dismantling the aura of invincibility that was one of the Mongols' most powerful weapons. There was also a practical consideration that illustrates the kind of multi-level thinking that characterized Mamluk strategic planning. The Crusader states still occupied sections of the Palestinian coast. Their relationship with Egypt was hostile. The Crusaders and the Mamluks had been fighting intermittently for decades, but their relationship with the Mongols was complicated. There had been diplomatic contacts between Hulagu and various Christian rulers, including some Crusader lords, exploring the possibility of an alliance against the Muslim powers. If Qutuz did not move quickly, he risked allowing time for those relationships to solidify into a military partnership that would put Crusader forces alongside the Mongols for the assault on Egypt. He moved quickly. He also, in one of the more remarkable diplomatic maneuvers of the century, negotiated safe passage through Crusader territory for the march north. The Crusaders, watching the two most dangerous military powers in the region prepare to fight each other, made the intelligent decision to step aside and observe. It was one of history's cleaner examples of a third party correctly identifying their most rational option. Kitpuka, receiving reports of the Egyptian advance, did not significantly alter his dispositions. Why would he? The Egyptians were coming to him. That was ideal. It saved him the march south. The pattern was familiar, a Muslim army marching north in a display of defiance that would dissolve as soon as contact was made and the Mongol pressure applied. He would meet them in the open, where his cavalry had room to operate, and the result would be the same as it had been every other time. He chose to advance toward the Jezreel Valley, the broad agricultural plain in what is now northern Israel, not far from the ancient spring of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, named for a tradition that placed the biblical confrontation between David and Goliath somewhere in its vicinity. The valley was open, flat, good cavalry country, exactly the kind of terrain where Mongol tactical advantages would be decisive. Baibars had been counting on that. The night before the battle, Baibars conducted one of the most carefully managed military performances in medieval history. He moved the main Mamluk force, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 cavalry under Qutuz, into concealed positions in the hills flanking the valley. The concealment was not difficult. The terrain cooperated, with ridges and ravines that provided cover for large formations. What was difficult was the discipline required to keep thousands of soldiers silent and still while the operation unfolded. What Baibars left in the valley was a vanguard, approximately 3,000 cavalry under his own command, visible, positioned near the springs, apparently confident. Just enough force to look like a credible forward element, too many to dismiss as scouts, too few to be the entire army. Kitpuka, riding south with his vanguard the following morning, would see exactly what he expected to see: a Mamluk cavalry force in loose formation, positioned near the water source, holding position. The sun came up over the hills to the east and fell across the valley floor. The morning was cool, the sky clear. Horses moved in the light, their breath visible in the September air. Baibars sat his mount in the center of his vanguard and watched the northern horizon. Somewhere beyond that ridge, Kitpuka was moving. Then came the moment nobody saw coming, including the men who caused it. The Mongol vanguard crested the northern hills and descended toward the valley floor, and as they came, they fell into their standard approach formation. Heavy cavalry at the center, light archer cavalry on the flanks, reserve units positioned to exploit the breakthrough that everyone in that formation expected would come within the hour.
It was the same arrangement that had been used at Legnica, at Mohi, at the Indus River, against the Jin dynasty in China, the tactical vocabulary of invincibility deployed one more time. Shift your perspective for a moment. You are not Baibars, you are Kitbuka, and you are looking down at the valley from the ridge. You see the Mamluk vanguard near the springs. You estimate their number, 3,000, perhaps a little more. You know, because your scouts have told you, that the Egyptian army marched north from Cairo, but you do not know their full strength, because your intelligence is incomplete. The Mamluk concealment operation worked. You see what you see, 3,000 cavalry, holding position, apparently waiting for you.
Your entire career has told you that when an enemy sees a Mongol army approaching, they either submit or they break. These men are doing neither. They are waiting. That is unusual. It is not, however, a warning sign. It is an invitation. An army that holds position in the face of a Mongol approach is an army that thinks it can fight you. An army that thinks it can fight you is an army that will stand and be destroyed rather than fleeing to be hunted down piecemeal. This is better, not worse. This is a clean engagement, a decisive battle, exactly the kind of encounter that eliminates an enemy completely. You descend into the valley. What happened over the next 30 minutes represents one of the most precisely calibrated pieces of battlefield theater in the history of warfare. Baibars let the Mongols close to bow range, which was approximately 200 meters for a composite bow at full draw. At that distance, the Mongol archers began to shoot, and men began to fall. Baibars watched this happen and made no dramatic adjustment. He let his men take casualties. This was necessary. An enemy that does not take casualties when you shoot at them is an enemy that knows it is performing. The Mamluk vanguard had to absorb real damage in order for the deception to remain credible. Then, at a moment calculated to look exactly like the tipping point, the moment when a unit under fire decides that staying is worse than running, Baibars raised his banner and turned his horse. The entire vanguard wheeled and began to pull back toward the south. Not in a rout, that was the critical detail. In a rout, riders scatter individually, each man looking for his own escape route. What the Mongols saw was not a rout. It was a formation pulling back under pressure, still organized, still recognizable as a unit, but clearly in retreat, clearly having made the decision that the position was untenable and that withdrawal was necessary. This was, to every Mongol officer watching, the entirely familiar early stage of a pattern they had seen dozens of times. The enemy makes a show of resolve, the show collapses under Mongol pressure, the retreat begins, the rout follows, the slaughter follows the rout. Kitbuka committed his forces to the pursuit. This was the decision that ended the battle before the main engagement had even begun, although nobody in that valley understood that yet. The moment Kitbuka's full force entered the valley in pursuit of the retreating Mamluk vanguard, he had ceded initiative entirely to Baibars. He was now moving where Baibars wanted him to move, at the speed Baibars wanted him to move, focused on exactly what Baibars wanted him focused on. The pursuit was the weapon, and the Mongols had handed it to their enemy. Baibars controlled the speed of his retreat with extraordinary precision. Too fast and the Mongols would not commit fully, would keep reserve forces on the ridge in case of a reversal. Too slow and the forward Mongol cavalry would catch his rearguard and the vanguard would be destroyed before the trap could close. The ideal speed was one that kept the Mongols moving confidently forward while denying them the satisfaction of a clean catch. A speed that said, "We are running, but we have not yet given up. Push a little harder and you will have us." He maintained that speed for approximately 3 miles. 3 miles moving south through the valley, the Mongol cavalry surging forward behind him, their formations stretching as faster units outpaced slower ones, as the excitement of a seemingly imminent destruction of an enemy force did what excitement always does to military discipline: loosened it, pulled it apart, replaced the careful coordination of approach with the more instinctive energy of chase. The Mongol army that crossed the ridge in ordered formation was not the same army that moved through the valley 3 miles later. The order had dissolved. The units were intermingled. The reserve was in motion. The attention of every commander, every officer, every warrior in that force was focused south, focused forward, focused on the retreating Mamluk cavalry that seemed, any moment now, about to break entirely.
Kuchus had been watching from the ridge above the eastern flank of the valley. He had waded through the silence that must have been one of the hardest things to maintain, thousands of cavalry horses trained to stillness in the hills while the thunder of pursuit rolled through the valley below. He watched the Mongol formation enter the valley. He watched it stretch. He watched the rearguard commit. He watched the last Mongol reserve unit cross the ridge and descend into the valley floor. Then he raised his own banner. On both sides of the valley, simultaneously, the hills erupted. Not a trickle of cavalry appearing over a ridge, a flood, thousands of horsemen in full charge, screaming, their horses accelerating from concealment into full gallop, pouring down the slopes from east and west into the flanks of the Mongol formation that had, moments before, been chasing what it thought was a beaten enemy. At the same moment, Baibars wheeled his vanguard and charged back north.
The Mongols were now receiving attacks from 3 directions simultaneously. The vanguard they had been chasing had become an assault on their front. Fresh cavalry, far more numerous than anything their scouts had warned them about, was crashing into both flanks. The valley, which had looked like open cavalry country perfect for Mongol operations, had become a killing ground. The psychological impact of what happened in the next 60 seconds cannot be overstated. The Mongol army had been in pursuit mode, the mental state of a predator closing on prey, attention focused forward, energy committed to acceleration. The reversal that now confronted them was not just a tactical problem, it was a categorical violation of reality, as every Mongol warrior in that valley understood it. This was not how battles worked. Prey did not become predators. Running armies did not turn and attack. The equation had been fixed in the Mongol experience for 40 years. Contact means pursuit. Pursuit means destruction of the enemy. The only question is the geometry of the slaughter. That equation had just been solved the wrong way, and the men who had lived their entire military lives inside it had no prepared response. The Mongol decimal system, which functioned so effectively in open terrain where unit commanders could see their superiors and respond to signals, began to collapse. The dust from thousands of hooves moving in multiple directions simultaneously created a visual fog. Horn signals designed to coordinate maneuvers were inaudible over the noise of combat. Unit commanders who needed orders could not reach their superiors. Unit commanders who needed to issue orders could not see their men. The tight interlocking structure that had made the Mongol army capable of executing complex maneuvers under fire was a machine that required information to function, and information had become impossible. Mamluk training, by contrast, had been specifically designed for exactly this scenario. The Firasiya emphasized individual excellence and unit-level cohesion precisely because high-intensity cavalry combat was inherently chaotic and required warriors who could operate effectively without constant command input. A Mamluk warrior in a melee was not waiting for orders. He was executing the skills he had spent a decade developing, responding to the immediate tactical reality in front of him with the reflexes of a man who had performed these movements 10,000 times. The difference in armor also mattered. Mamluk heavy cavalry wore lamellar armor, overlapping plates of metal or hardened leather that provided significantly better protection against arrow strikes than the lighter protection many Mongol warriors carried. In the mobile, long-range engagement that Mongol tactics preferred, this difference was manageable. You kept your distance and shot until the enemy broke. In the close-quarters melee that Baibars had engineered, it became decisive. Mamluk warriors absorbed arrow strikes that would have unseated Mongol opponents and kept coming. Kitbuka attempted to rally his forces. This is documented in multiple sources, and it speaks to his quality as a commander. When the catastrophe became undeniable, he did not flee. He moved through the chaos, trying to reconstruct the coherent formations that might have given his army a fighting chance. He failed not through any personal failure of courage or ability, but because the tactical situation had progressed beyond the point where rallying was possible. The Mamluk attack from 3 directions had shattered the Mongol unit structure at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The pieces could not be reassembled under that kind of pressure. There is one moment in the battle that deserves to be treated with the slowness it deserves, because it represents the crisis within the crisis, the moment when even the Mamluk assault itself nearly unraveled. Partway through the engagement, one section of the Mamluk line began to buckle. The Mongols, even in their disorganized state, were dangerous. A
a concentrated group of Mongol heavy cavalry broke through a gap in the eastern Mamluk line and began pushing south, threatening to split the encircling force and create the kind of escape route that would have allowed a significant Mongol contingent to retreat, regroup, and potentially carry a more accurate account of Mamluk numbers and tactics back to Hulagu. Kutuz saw it. He did what Mamluk commanders were trained to do in exactly this situation. He exposed himself. He removed his helmet, sources are fairly consistent on this detail, and rode into the threatened section of the line himself, fully visible to his own troops, shouting the war cry that every Mamluk warrior had been trained to associate with the absolute maximum commitment of a commander who was not prepared to do something he was not prepared to do himself. The effect was immediate. The wavering Mamluk units steadied. The breach was sealed. Kutuz had gambled his life on the psychology of leadership, and won. It is worth dwelling on this moment because it illuminates something about the character of the men who built what happened at Ain Jalut. Kutuz and Baibars were not heroic figures in the simple sense. Their relationship was deeply complicated. Baibars would eventually assassinate Kutuz a few weeks after the battle in a dispute over the distribution of the conquered territories, which tells you something about the moral texture of the world they inhabited. They were political animals as much as military ones, men whose loyalty was always partly conditional, whose alliances were always subject to the calculations of personal advancement. But on September 3rd, 1260, in a valley in Palestine, Kutuz put himself in front of a charging line of Mongol cavalry and held his ground. And that matters. Whatever came after, that happened. The battle did not end quickly. These were not frightened conscripts or urban militias folding under the first real pressure. These were Mongol veterans, hardened by decades of the most intense military experience available in the medieval world, and they fought with the ferocity of men who understood at some point in those terrible minutes that they were going to die and chose to do it on their feet. For several hours, the valley was a killing ground of extraordinary violence. The Mamluk encirclement was not a clean box. There were gaps. There were attempted breakouts. There were moments when the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. But the fundamental asymmetry of the situation was irreversible from the moment the trap closed. The Mongols were fighting from inside a circle against enemies attacking from the perimeter. They were outnumbered at every point of local contact because Mamluk forces could concentrate while Mongol forces could not coordinate. They were fighting on terrain that denied them their primary advantage, the mobile, fluid engagement in which their coordination and speed produced the characteristic envelopments that had destroyed army after army. And they were fighting men who had, in terms of close-quarters mounted combat, been trained to do exactly this, against exactly this kind of opponent. Kitbuka died in the valley. The sources disagree about the precise circumstances. Some say he was captured and executed, others that he died in the fighting, but they agree on the fact of his death and on its significance. He was an Nestorian Christian, one of the senior commanders in the Mongol hierarchy, experienced, decorated, and trusted. His death was not just the loss of a general, it was the proof that the system had failed, that the Mongols could be killed, that their commanders could be killed, that the aura of invincibility was not a fact of nature, but a story that had just been changed. The survivors who escaped that valley were fewer than anyone had expected. The Mamluk pursuit was aggressive and sustained. Mongol forces that broke through the encirclement were chased north, harried by cavalry, and destroyed piecemeal before they could consolidate. Baibars, true to his nature, made the pursuit as complete as possible. He understood, with the strategic clarity that defined his career, that allowing a significant Mongol force to survive and report was almost as dangerous as losing the battle. The news that would travel north needed to carry not just the fact of defeat, but the scale of it. The news that reached Damascus was, by all contemporary accounts, almost incomprehensible to the people who heard it. The Mongols had been destroyed. Not defeated, not repulsed, not forced to withdraw, destroyed. An army that had never lost a major open field engagement in 40 years had been annihilated in a valley in Palestine by a force that had chosen to attack it rather than hide behind walls and pray. Damascus capitulated to Egyptian authority almost immediately, the Mamluk garrison, suddenly confronting a reality in which the Mongol military machine was not, after all, invincible, decided that discretion was preferable to the kind of last-stand heroics that might have impressed their commanders but would not have changed the strategic situation. They withdrew north. The population of Damascus, emerging from months of Mongol occupation, received the Mamluk forces with the enthusiasm of people who had just learned that a nightmare they thought was permanent had an end. The political reverberations moved faster than horses could carry messages. In Syria, in Mesopotamia, in Anatolia, Mongol-aligned governors suddenly found themselves recalculating their situations. The submission to Mongol authority that had seemed like the only rational choice 3 months earlier was now one option among several. The equation had changed. Resistance had been demonstrated to be possible, and resistance, once demonstrated as possible, has a way of becoming contagious. Hulagu Khan received the news from his court in Azerbaijan and faced what must have been one of the more disorienting moments in a career defined by the expectation of victory. He had options. He could marshal his remaining Western forces for a punitive expedition, a demonstration that the Mongol Empire was still capable of projecting force into the Levant and Egypt, that one battle did not change the fundamental balance of power. His forces in Persia and Mesopotamia, depleted by the withdrawal of units to support the succession dispute in the east, but still formidable, could potentially have been mobilized for exactly this purpose. He did not do it. The reasons are multiple and not entirely certain, but the primary constraint appears to have been the political situation in the Mongol heartland. The succession struggle following Mungka's death was developing into a full civil war between Kublai and Arik Boka, and Hulagu's political survival depended on choosing the right side at the right moment. Committing his forces to a renewed Western campaign would have left him politically exposed in the contest that actually determined the future of the Mongol Empire. He chose to consolidate. He accepted the Euphrates as the western boundary of his authority and focused his attention east.
That decision, made in a court in Azerbaijan based on internal Mongol political calculations, produced one of history's cleaner examples of a second-order consequence. Because the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that Hulagu founded in Persia, never again pushed seriously into the Levant. The western edge of Mongol expansion had been fixed, not by a treaty, not by geography, not by a gradual erosion of military capability, but by a single afternoon in a valley in Palestine. After Ain Jalut, the boundary held. Egypt remained independent, the Levant remained contested, the Islamic world retained its capacity for political and cultural development, the Christian Crusader states survived a few more decades, the Ottoman Empire, which would eventually absorb all of this territory and reshape the political geography of 3 continents, grew in the space that the Mongol withdrawal created. There is a line of causation, admittedly complex and difficult to trace with precision, that connects the Battle of Ain Jalut to the existence of the modern Middle East as a geographic and cultural reality. The Mongol path, had it not been stopped, would have led to the absorption of Egypt and North Africa into the Mongol world system, an event that would have been as transformative as the fall of Baghdad, and the consequences of which we can only speculate about because they did not happen. What happened instead was that a Mamluk slave army won a battle in a valley, and the trajectory of civilizations bent in a different direction. The Mongol Empire itself continued to exist for another century, but not as a single entity. Within a generation of Ain Jalut, it had fragmented into competing khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, each pursuing its own interests, fighting each other with the same ferocity their ancestors had directed outward, none possessing the unified command structure or the overwhelming military superiority that had made expansion seem unstoppable. The age of Mongol world conquest ended not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic fracture, an empire that had been maintained by the force of individual genius and the accumulated psychological capital of invincibility, discovering that neither of those things was inheritable. Baibars, for his part, became Sultan of Egypt within weeks of Ain Jalut. He murdered Kutuz in an ambush following a hunting trip, claiming that Kutuz had promised him the governorship of Aleppo and then withheld it. Whether this account is accurate, slightly accurate, or a subsequent rationalization is impossible to determine at this distance. What is certain is that Baibars was not a man whose loyalty to individuals outlasted his assessment of his own interests, and that his assessment of his own interests was consistently accurate. He ruled Egypt for 17 years, fought the Crusaders, fought the Mongols again in several subsequent engagements, consolidated Mamluk authority across Syria, and died in 1277, possibly of poison, possibly from infected wounds, the sources disagree, having transformed a slave institution into a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 2.5 centuries. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most effective military and political operators of the 13th century. He was also ruthless in ways that strained the limits of any heroic narrative. He ordered assassinations, he destroyed enemies in ways that served political purposes but produced significant civilian suffering. He was, in the language of his own world, a successful ruler, which meant he was good at doing things that successful rulers do, including things that, examined outside their context, are simply terrible. This is where the story requires something more uncomfortable than the clean hero narrative that most documentary scripts would prefer to deliver. The Battle of Ain Jalut did not save the Islamic world from a Mongol destruction that was categorically worse than what had already happened. The Mongols had already destroyed Baghdad, they had already shattered the Abbasid Caliphate, they had already killed millions and dismantled civilizations that had taken centuries to build. Ain Jalut stopped a future that would have been worse, probably significantly worse, but it did not undo the past. The libraries of Baghdad did not reassemble themselves. The scholars and scientists and poets who died in the sack did not come back to life because a Mamluk cavalry charge succeeded in a valley in Palestine 12 years later. The men who won that battle had themselves been purchased as children, stripped of their families, defined from birth by a system that converted human beings into instruments of war. The institution that produced Baibars and Kutuz was, by the standards of any ethical framework, an institution built on slavery. Its excellence as a military system did not change that. Its effectiveness in defending the Islamic world against conquest did not change that. The cognitive dissonance of celebrating a victory won by slaves against an army of conquerors is one that the history of Ain Jalut forces you to sit with if you are paying attention. And then there is Baibars himself, the man who built the trap, the man who held his nerve through 3 miles of controlled retreat under fire, who timed the signal that closed the ambush with a precision that would have been remarkable in any era, who then, with the victory still warm, killed the man he had fought alongside, who went on to rule with a combination of military genius and political viciousness that made Egypt strong and its inhabitants not entirely free. History does not give you clean heroes. It gives you Baibars, complicated, brilliant, violent, consequential, human. Here is what the Battle of Ain Jalut actually proved, stripped of the mythology that inevitably accumulates around decisive military victories. It proved that the most powerful force in the medieval world was a system, and that systems have exploitable patterns. Baibars won not because he was stronger, not because he was luckier, not because divine favor had transferred itself from one civilization to another. He won because he spent years studying an enemy that everyone else had decided was undefeatable, identified the specific mechanisms by which that enemy produced its victories, and then engineered a set of conditions in which those mechanisms destroyed their owners. The Mongols lost not because they were weak, they lost because they were predictable, because their system of tactics had been so successful for so long that it had calcified from a set of principles into a set of reflexes. Because the confidence that comes from 40 years without a major defeat is indistinguishable from the inside, from the blindness that comes from 40 years without a major defeat. Because Kitbuka looked at 3,000 cavalry near a spring and saw exactly what every Mongol victory had taught him to see, and never considered that a man had spent years designing that image specifically to be seen.
This is the thing about systems. They are their own undoing, eventually. Not because they stop working, but because their success creates the conditions for someone to learn how they work. And once someone learns how they work, the system becomes a weapon in the hands of the enemy. The Mongols built the most sophisticated military machine in the history of the medieval world. Baibars disassembled it in an afternoon. He used it as a blueprint, mapped every component, identified every assumption the machine depended on, and replaced each one with a carefully constructed illusion. The machine ran perfectly, exactly as designed, all the way to the bottom of the trap. September 3rd, 1260, the Spring of Goliath. The day the world's most feared army was destroyed by the thing it was most certain of, its own invincibility. That certainty was the last weapon the Mongols ever gave away for free.